Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Chambers. I'm the chair of the History Department. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge that here at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus, we are on the ancestral and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people, including the Dakota land ceded under force in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The history department recognizes, and many of our faculty and students investigate, the complex and layered history of this place. It is important to acknowledge the people on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So some of you have been to the book club before, some may be new to the book club, but I'm really glad to see you here today. We have our department administrator, Amanda Nelson, keeping things going in the background. And you'll see that our format is that we're going to invite our authors to introduce the book. Then we'll bring in another person to sort of engage them in conversation. And towards the end, we'll have time for you to pose your questions. So anytime you're thinking of questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. And when we get to that portion towards the end of the hour, I will read those out for our guests. So it's really a great pleasure for me today to welcome our guests. Jeff Manuel completed his PhD in history in our department in 2009 and is currently professor of history at Southern Illinois University. He specializes in environmental history with a focus on the Midwest, having previously published a book on Minnesota's Iron Range. His co-author, Thomas Rogers, is a professor of history at Emory University, who also works on environmental history and labor in Brazil, a topic on which he's published 2 earlier books. And I'm really looking forward to hearing about how they connected to then write this book together and the process that went into that. So we'll be discussing their book, Ethanol, A Hemispheric History for the Future of Biofuels, which was published last fall by the University of Oklahoma Press. And we're also joined by our colleague, Tracy Deutsch, who's a historian of capitalism and critical food studies. So it'll be interesting to see agricultural products that could be used for food, but also can be used for fuel. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our authors, Jeff Manuel and Tom Rogers, to tell us about the book, and then we'll start the conversation. Thank you.
I'll kick things off. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's just really, really wonderful to see so many familiar faces out there virtually. I can't believe it's been, so long since I was part of the academic community at the University of Minnesota. It doesn't feel like that long to me, but I know it has. So it's really great to see that and be reminded of what a rich intellectual community you all have built in the history department. I think about that every week, almost every day on this job. So it's a delight to be back and talking to you about the book that Tom and I recently published. So Ethanol, A Hemispheric History for the Future of Biofuels. Copy of it here. Available at anywhere books are sold, I'm told to remind people. This book came out of a long-term collaboration that Tom and I sort of fell into. And I think we can talk about that a little bit because it has a nice Minnesota connection as well. But for those who haven't had a chance to read the book or look at it, what it is, it's a history of a transnational history of ethanol fuel in the United States and Brazil over about the past century or so. And for those of you who may be thinking ethanol, what is that? I always say that when you fill up your car, if you're a driver and you fill up your car at the gas station, there somewhere on the tank is like a grimy little sticker in the United States that says, contains 10% ethanol. And that means that, of what you're pumping in your tank, about 10% of that is alcohol that in the US comes from corn. If you were in Brazil, it would come most likely from sugarcane. And as a Midwesterner and someone who, drives a car as part of modern life, I have always been kind of curious about that. Like, where did that come from? And so Tom and I spent a while digging into that. And really, I sort of initially thought this was going to be a US story. but in the course of our collaboration realized it was in fact what we were calling a hemispheric story, mostly between the United States and Brazil. And we'll talk, I think we'll hopefully get a chance to talk more about kind of how that collaboration came together and things like that. So I'm excited to talk about that. I'll pass it over to Tom.
Yeah, not to extend this too far, but this really was a felicitous combination of kind of bumping into Jeff doing this work on the US side when I was researching a book that I knew would be partially about ethanol and was getting more and more into an understanding that it was a much broader story than just contained within Brazil, even if Brazil has very distinctive parts of that story. Having in the 1970s, for instance, adopted this very large crash program to produce a huge amount of ethanol to drive cars purely on that fuel, as opposed to a mix. Now you can drive on any mix of them. Um, and I think that one of the things that we came to realize only through the collaborative research was just how thoroughgoing the transnational links were. And so far from being a comparative story, it really is a transnational story. But I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
And I think we'll pass it over to Tracy now, who has graciously written up some questions to kind of kick off the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff and Tom. I learned a ton from this book, and I'm super interested in learning more through the conversation. Um, I before we dive into the substance of the argument, I wanted to give you a chance to talk more about how you came to write it. How did each of you become interested in ethanol, and then what drew you to doing a collaborative project?
Yeah. I'm happy to kick things off if that's okay with you, Tom. Like I said, it's a good story because it does have a Minnesota connection. This is about a decade or so ago. I was doing some initial research, thinking about a second book project. I'd published my first book, which had been my dissertation at Minnesota, looking at deindustrialization in Minnesota's Iron Range. And I was sort of curious about ethanol fuel. My campus here at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, where the Edwardsville campus, not the Carbondale campus, we're right outside St. Louis. We actually have on our campus the National Corn to Ethanol Research Center, which was, like most things in ethanol, I've learned a little bit of a government boondoggle created by Dennis Hastert. Remember that guy, the former Speaker of the House? Put in Illinois as sort of a pork barrel project. But I had worked with them on and off talking about things, and it just got more and more curious about the history of, how did it get to be that about 10% of our fuel is ethanol? And so I had some time to research that. And if you do anything in energy history in the United States, you end up at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. It's sort of like a required research trip. So I was down in Atlanta for several days to collect some initial archival research at the Carter Library. And a good friend of mine, also a PhD from Minnesota, Danny LaChance, I knew he was down there as a faculty member at Emory University. Danny was officially an American Studies PhD, but we were part of those cohorts that kind of went back and forth, which is one of the things I always loved about the program at Minnesota. Anyways, Danny and I had dinner just to kind of catch up and things like that. And I think I was explaining what I was doing. And he said, I think, so I've got a colleague who's researching a book about the history of ethanol, but in Brazil. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And Danny very graciously, I think, made the initial connection. And then Tom and I got lunch just off campus at Emory, and just to kind of compare notes. And I think, immediately recognized there were some really interesting parallels in the stories of Brazil's ethanol program and the United States ethanol program from like the 70s to the present. And we sort of thought, I think we thought, hey, this might be a good candidate for maybe a panel at some conferences or something. And we did put together a panel, I forget what year that was, at the American Society for Environmental History conference, about the history of biofuels. And it's always sort of thought like, hey, if there's opportunities to keep working together, let's keep that in mind. And then we were very fortunate to receive an ACLS Foundation long-term grant, collaborative grant to do the research for the book, which is really what enabled this to happen. And at that point, we were kind of off and running and started with this project and really rethought this not as two separate, comparative stories, but like, hey, is there a truly transnational unified history here? Tom, I don't know if you want to have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, my trajectory into it is pretty similar. I was midway through the writing of my second book. My first book had been about the northeastern sugarcane region in Brazil, in the state of Pernambuco, and was kind of long-term environmental analysis to try to answer a couple of labor historical questions, which is to say there was some major mobilization of sugarcane workers in the 1960s and 70s that everybody knew about, that are famous around Brazil, because rural workers hadn't mounted a major strike where 250,000 of them walked off the job. So I wanted to answer these labor historical questions by looking into the kinds of environmental impacts over the long term that the sugarcane industry had had. For the second book, I was interested in that time period, but from the lens of agricultural modernization. Instead of just looking at one region and one sugar producing zone, thinking about Brazil's larger experience with the Green Revolution, basically. What did Brazil's version of that look like? But to finding a vehicle to tell that story, because it's too big a story to tell for an agricultural juggernaut like that. And so this ethanol program from the 70s became that vehicle. And that's what got me into ethanol more as a kind of object of research. And so I was deep into that and had found all this material and realized, there's a different book in there. And as it turned out, that the much better version of that other book was a book to co-write with Jeff to tell the bigger story about ethanol at the hemispheric level.
Thank you both. Yeah, I think one of the many successes of this book is that transnational story. This is a book about two very different political economies and ecosystems that becomes a single narrative thread as you're reading through it, um, which which I really enjoyed as an Americanist. I found it there are many paths into the story. Um, One of those is a really fascinating point you make in the beginning of the book, that gasoline was neither the only nor the obvious choice for the first automobiles. Um, and in fact, inventors and manufacturers actually experimented with lots of different kinds of fuels. Can you just describe for folks what some of those other options were and your sense of why gasoline and more broadly fossil fuels won out? And I guess as an ancillary question, is that the right way to talk about this, right? Is what happened to gasoline actually winning? So I'll let you
Yeah,
answer
I'll
in
jump
whatever
in there if
order.
that's okay, Tom. It's a great question, Tracy. And yeah, one of the parts that I enjoyed the most in doing this research was going back, a little over a century into that kind of early history of automobility in the late 19th century, very early 20th century. And there is the kind of well-known story, at least in histories of technology, about, the contingency of what was going to fuel early automobiles. There's electric cars, there were steam-powered cars, which was familiar from steam engines in the 19th century, and there were internal combustion engines. And this is kind of like a case study that we often sometimes use in the classroom and things like that, just as a reminder that, people make choices about technology. And we're not far from the only historians to write about this. But there's another wrinkle to it that I think was really interesting, which was, even though internal combustion engines sort of become the dominant technology for automobiles, as we all know, although up in the air now, of course, suddenly in the past, 15, 20 years with the return to electric vehicles. But even as internal combustion engines became predominant, especially first in the United States and then globally, there's this like second order debate over, well, an internal combustion engine just needs explosive fuel or gases. So, and that could be a lot of things. And there was a big debate over, like, would that be gasoline or would it be alcohol? And there were really real and vigorous debates over these two fuels in those very early years of automobility. That were interesting to look at. And I think from my perspective, and I think Tom could maybe add to this or have his own take on it, but I'm just really interested in sort of reminding readers of the contingency of that. I think for me in the background is always this question about, as we think about the dominance of fossil fuels in the 20th century to today, which of course behind that has this other question about climate change and energy transitions. I find it helpful to remind readers and for myself to think of the sort of enormous contingency of those choices that were made. And I don't want to discount the path dependencies that get put in place once you did that. Once you go through a century of fuel distribution networks and businesses and engineering decisions, there are incredible path dependencies. But I still find it helpful to go back to those early moments and just, that classic historical move to say, hey, it could have been otherwise, right? Like people made choices here and they could have chosen differently. Tom, do you want to flesh that
Yeah,
out?
I like Tracy, that question of is it even the correct language to say that gasoline or fossil fuels won out? One of the working titles, actually the working title that we used the longest for this, that didn't end up being the title of the book, was The Perennial Alternative. And that's was partly to emphasize a point that we do make in the book anyway, which is that gasoline won out in a sense, but it won out again and again and again because it was constantly called into question. And so there was the big debate in the age of early automobility when people like Henry Ford were proponents of alcohol, excuse me, and then maybe the appearance that gasoline will become the fuel, but then it was called into question repeatedly in the 20s and depending on whether you're talking about the United States or Brazil at different points in the 20s and the 30s, in the era of World War II, when so much of the fossil fuels that were available were going towards the war effort, and then very prominently in the 1970s. And so even with those powerful path dependencies that were woven into a global oil market and all of the refinery infrastructure and distribution and all of that, it still would get called into question periodically.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the most interesting parts of this book to me was that it's not as if once the internal combustion engine emerged as the dominant technology for cars, that answered the question of what kind of fuel was going to be used. Like that question recurs repeatedly over the course of the 20th and into the 21st century. Um, and maybe we can stay with that theme for a minute. One of the implications of that argument is that this story that we always tell about America, about the transition to what people call car country, um, and fossil fuel dependence is more descriptive than analytic. Like, in other words, that describes something that happened, but it doesn't explain why it happened. And so maybe you can talk in a little bit more detail about what put the US, but also Brazil onto that path. And I know the story in Brazil is different, right, than the US.
Yeah.
So, Tom, maybe you can explain what some of those differences are and what the story is
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense
also
kind of
there.
historically to have Jeff start because I mean,
Yeah,
just
no, I know.
the conversion takes place before. But yeah, then I'm happy to fill in.
Jeff, do
Uh,
you want to talk about that?
yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, Tracy. And we sort of thought about it in the book in terms of in looking at her over the long term, there is this well-known story about car country and, the dependency that gets built in. And there's a rich historiographic debate about these things that, not just historiographic, but, policy planners, energy planning people, energy policy folks who sort of think through like, how did we get to this point if we want to undo it or make it better or things like that. And I think historians, we joined a lot of historians who've added a kind of, tried to really emphasize a kind of contextual, just a lot of context to that debate. The way we've sort of frame it, and I think we're onto something here, is that there was a sort of a series of crises um, that follow that initial moment of kind of cars become dominant at first in the United States and then quite a bit later in Brazil, and in Europe and places like that. But there's a number of crises. The first happens in the 1920s when there's fears that gasoline is going to run out very early on. I mean, in very prominent places, people saying like, yeah, gasoline's great, but we're running out of it. I mean, Henry Ford is saying this in the 19-teens. The US Geological Survey is saying it in the 20s. But then in particular, there's a crisis in the 30s, a crisis of capitalism in general, and that affects, particularly we look at the way it affects agricultural heartlands in the United States and in Brazil. Has a lot of differences there, of course, in the 1930s, but there's a common thread of kind of overproduction. Right. In the United States, this leads to the Agricultural Adjustment Act and, the New Deal farm policies that actually try and, reduce how much farmers are growing. In Brazil, they're burning coffee, mountains of coffee beans on the docks in Santos, at the port in Santos. So this sense that we need new market, we need to create new non-food markets, or this whole, the kind of agricultural economy that had been built up just was not going to work. And so there's a crisis around that. And they talk about, well, alcohol fuel might be an important way to get around that. And there's some moves towards it. But at the end of the day, they need a short-term fix, which becomes, in the US, limited cropland, in Brazil, forming kind of corporatist, also, restrictive policies and things like that around that. And then there's another crisis with World War II, the need to rapidly ramp up fossil fuels to win the war. And then there's a crisis, by sort of a strange term for it, after the war, with how to meet the enormous economic development demands of the post-war years. That looks a little different in the United States and Brazil, of course, in the 1950s and 1960s. But nonetheless, there's this sense that something needs to fuel this development. And so what we kind of came to is there's this interesting sense that at all moments, people keep saying like, yeah, ethanol is kind of a good idea, or something other than gasoline is a good idea, but that's a long-term issue, right? They're like, let's get to that, but hey, we've got this immediate crisis we need to deal with, whether it's the Depression or the war or building out the suburbs or whatever. And petroleum is kind of the quick fix for that. And we see this as a pretty long-term trend. The sense of, we know that there are choices and options, but one seems like, we want to get there, but just not right now, right? There's stuff we have to deal with right now. And sadly, I think that, we remain stuck in that cycle in many ways, right up to the present. Tom, I'm sure you have lots to add on the.
Yeah, I mean, just to start at the end point about where we are right now, there's a couple of ways of seeing the current moment, which, I mean, I know, Tracy, we can get to a more contemporary moment later too, but just to preview, since it's part of the structure of the argument that as Jeff said, we saw repeating patterns, including this kind of cyclical presence of crisis. And right now, one way of seeing it is that, well, that we need a long-term fix that might be electrification, but the short-term solution is still fossils. But interestingly, there's ethanol again saying, oh, but maybe the short-term solution is actually ethanol, being as a bridge fuel, or functioning in some way as that kind of fix. So, but to go back, how did Brazil become car culture? Because it did. That was certainly something that was an emphatic mirroring to the United States, albeit not along the same timeline. Part of it had to do with notions of what constituted modernity, and a kind of mimicking of a pattern that was not only being modeled by the United States, but being exported by the United States, and exported in the form of their own car companies, among other things. And so really the decisive moment for Brazil comes in the 1950s with a charismatic president who really invested in expanding the auto industry, and not through Brazilian-owned auto companies, but through deals with Ford and General Motors, as well as Fiat and others, but it was really an adoption not just of a kind of model of the dominance of cars and the oil consumption that went along with that, but also of the actual same companies. And so the exploding highway construction, the ring roads around massive cities, and all of those things, very familiar already in the United States, became hallmarks of the 50s and the 60s, and then moving along.
Yeah, and in the case of Brazil, the construction of whole cities,
Yeah. I mean,
right?
Brasilia is
Built
emblematic.
around, yeah,
Yes,
just really
that's right.
such a powerful image. Um, so maybe we should, in the interest of time, kind of forge ahead to the later 20th and even early 21st centuries, where you really pick up the story of international finance and agribusiness in the US and these large producers in Brazil. And these become really important forces in the story of ethanol and fuels generally. Can each of you say something about how capital influenced rural life and crop production and fuel consumption in this later period?
Yeah, I'll pick that up, Tracy. It's such a good observation that is a story all through the 20th century in rural agricultural regions in the United States and Brazil. But we really trace the way it really intensifies in the past 50 years or so. I think we found the strongest evidence of it, starting in the 70s through the 80s and 90s, where ethanol's story starts to run really in parallel with the story of global agribusiness. And this is one of these moments where, a very small handful, frankly, of very powerful corporations are sort of steering the ship here. And a lot of these have almost all of them have U.S. Midwestern roots, except for the Brazilian ones. And many of them have Minnesota roots. I mean, Cargill Corporation is based in the Twin Cities, of course. I think still the world's largest privately held corporation, or the world's richest privately held corporation. I know Tom and I, when we were doing research in Brazil, you leave one of the big agricultural research campuses there, and up on the hill is Cargill's research campus there, kind of their own agricultural research campus, as there's a really powerful reminder of how these networks are transnational, flows of capital and scientific knowledge and things like that, that really sort of see, Sao Paulo state or Mato Grosso in Brazil as, similar to Iowa and Illinois and places like that. But we were also, I think, and that's a top level story. I think we were also really interested in trying to think of how that sort of the intensification of global agribusiness played out in everyday lives of farmers and people in these regions. That was one of the things I found most interesting. So we found really interesting stories that are almost like the flip side of the story of the farm crisis in the United States in the 80s. I think that story is pretty well known. Major financial crisis among farmers shakes a lot of people off the land, small farmers. But the flip side of that is another group of farmers who embrace this new role as saying, hey, we are global agribusiness producers. That's our role here. And we found really interesting examples of, young people being paid to take tours in Brazil as part of state extension programs, things like that. We interviewed a farmer from Minnesota, for example, who we came across, I think, in one of the news stories, who I believe, had listened to a speech by Minnesota Senator Rudy Boschwitz, if anybody remembers him, saying, hey, Brazil's your new competition. And he got mad about that and then got on a plane and flew down to Sao Paulo and drove like 1,000 miles around Brazil just to like scope it out. And so I don't know, I feel like those stories are far less known in the historical literature. And it just is really interesting for me to think about the whole generation now of agricultural producers who have kind of embraced this role, many of whom farm year round. They might farm in the Midwest and then fly to Brazil and grow down there. And we found some examples of it, the flows of capital and people going the other way as well, which maybe Tom wants to mention.
Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating to tour it wasn't an ethanol plant, but a biodiesel plant in central Illinois run by a Brazilian company. One of these families that exactly along this timeline in the 1970s with the big soy boom in Brazil expanded their holdings, became really big, bought out a bunch of smaller farmers, which was the pattern that was happening in both the United States and Brazil. Jeff had pointed to like the last 50 years as being this timeline, and it was decisive in both places and was linked as as that story of Sever Peterson that Jeff was referring to indicates, the family associated with Incobrasa, which I was mentioning. I do want to just highlight along the way here that I love the reference to that interview. That was part of the methodology for this book, is we interviewed dozens and dozens of people and learned so much through not what we would describe. We both teach oral history, and that wasn't exactly the methodology we were using. These were much more journalistic interviews. And many of them set up with people who were very practiced at being interviewed. We were interviewing policymakers, politicians, the former agricultural minister for Brazil, for instance, who has, probably done roughly 2 million interviews in his lifetime and had very pat stories. But getting that version directly from somebody who claims to have been one of the architects of the massive national alcohol program in Brazil was invaluable. And he was one of the people, too, who pointed to us towards this fact that that 50-year period, of course, had big internal differentiation as well. So on the Brazil side of the story, again, linked very tightly to the US side, the 90s ended up proving crucial for the evolution of the sugarcane industry as a whole. And it was because of creeping changes from the 70s and 80s became crashing changes then. One of the things that Jeff had pointed to maybe 15 minutes ago was the idea that ethanol for both corn farmers and sugarcane farmers, it was considered a co-product. It was another product to sell alongside the suite of the constellation of products that they could market and commodify out of their crops. And the more you have, the more markets you have, the more stable you can be and the more you can hedge. And Brazilian sugarcane producers in the 1990s got so consolidated that they managed to achieve incredible efficiencies, a lot of them at the expense of rural workers. Rural working people bore the brunt of this process in really serious, acute ways. But also, those efficiencies made Brazil really, really competitive again. And so, right now, Brazil produces 50% of the world's sugar. The world sugar market is accounted for, like half of that is Brazilian sugar. And the same efficiencies that can make them so incredibly cheap to make sugar are the efficiencies that made it so cheap to make ethanol and made ethanol come into direct competition with gasoline. And so anyway, a couple of extra highlights about that kind of timeline across 50 years.
And I'll just follow up real quickly, Dad. The other wrinkle that we found in the United States was sort of a pendulum that has swung back and forth in terms of people who really believe that ethanol might be an opportunity to kind of decentralize the energy system, small scale, farm level stills. Back in the 70s, you could go to Mother Earth News and buy a sort of a farm scale still for your farm. And we chart out, this was an old dream that Henry Wallace had about, kind of farmers fueling their own production, getting away from the monopoly of Rockefeller's oil and things like that. But what happens is they just find they can't really compete economically, and the pendulum swings towards agribusiness. Just as Tom said, in Brazil, a lot of really big agribusiness producers find that they can produce this stuff profitably at the razor thin margins that they have, but on massive scale. So, like here in Illinois, that's Archer Daniels Midland Corporation builds this enormous corn plant in Decatur, Illinois. It kicks out high fructose corn syrup, and then they also add the ability to add ethanol fuel to it. And by the 90s, they control most of that market because they can basically squeeze everybody else out of business.
Yeah, I have to say that image of the same plant producing high fructose corn syrup and ethanol, that's not something I can unknow. It
Yeah.
sticks with me. Similarly, I one thing I just want to amplify in what you said is that this rhetoric of ethanol as a particularly as a way to decentralize the energy grid and a way to support American farmers, especially corn farmers, um, is totally problematized by what's happening in Brazil, because in moments of acute need, the US imports ethanol from Brazil, where it
Right.
can be produced much more in larger quantities and less expensively than in the US. It's such a great example of how this transnational framework is. You don't really understand the history of ethanol in either country unless you can see it, unless you can see it in a transnational framework.
Right.
Super helpful. Um, we have a few minutes left, and so I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the lessons that you want people to take from this book, both about ethanol, but also about how to think about ethanol, because it seems to me this is a book that is both giving a super interesting history, but also giving us tools to think about that, to think about fuel differently, and maybe also to act in the present, particularly around climate change in a slightly different way. So I'll let you.
Yeah, great question, Tracy. I'll try and go quickly 'cause, I'd love to save time for questions too that other people have. I think, Tom and I, we talked about this at great length over many years of great collaboration. But for me, those kind of lessons or takeaways boil down to things, two main points. One is just that ethanol is really complicated. And I know that sounds really kind of banal, but it's important because the public rhetoric in the United States around the policy rhetoric around ethanol, I think really is really black or white. It's this kind of Manichaean thing where it's either a really important tool that's going to save American farmers and get us off fossil fuels, or, and I think this is more common these days, it was like, oh, that was a boondoggle. That's just a total ripoff for to support farmers. People feel like they know this because there was a West Wing episode about it. And Lord help you if you write about something about which there was a West Wing episode, because everybody feels like they're an expert because they saw the West Wing episode. And we just wanted to say that, it really, neither of those really captures what happened here over the 20th century and sort of the contingency and the choices that are part of it. So it's complicated. And then the second point is that you can't really understand it without taking this transnational perspective into account. As hopefully came through in the book, there's some really powerful ways in which even just in the United States case, they were following the Brazilians' lead. And I've been really surprised how even people who work in this industry for many years or are policymakers, members of Congress and things like that, are very unaware of that and hadn't really considered it. So I just think those are kind of the two main takeaways that I hope people take away from it. Pass it over to Tom.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I completely agree with those two. And the interesting thing for me was that it's depending on which facet of the ethanol questions you're considering, those facets are themselves complicated. And so, you could say, okay, I get it that it's complicated, but let's just talk about emissions. Let's just think about ethanol emissions versus gasoline emissions. And it's like, well, what time of year are we talking about? Are we, like, it's that even that and or well, let's just talk about land use, like, well, how are you measuring land impacts of the whole oil industry? How are you measuring? And so it's complicated in multi-dimensional ways. And so we found that Manichaean approach among a lot of the people that we spoke with. And it was interesting to us that a lot of these people who live ethanol as part of their professional lives, where we thought you're sitting in it, you're immersed in this, you understand that complexity, and yet many of them also have, found themselves at one end or another of a spectrum of ethanol good or ethanol bad, which is also something, just another facet about writing the book and then getting the book published. We talked to a number of editors who really, really wanted us to write a book that either trumpeted the benefits of this commodity or that tore apart the terrible scourge that is ethanol.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to the point of, specific editors who will not be named said, hey, if you'll consider rewriting this as a polemic, we're interested. And we're like,
Yeah.
well, not right. I'll also back out because I think your question is such a good one, Tracy. I mean, I think also for me, it's the question of how we as historians engage in broader debates about how to think about the climate crisis and energy transitions. I think a lot of the energy transition discussion, has this idea of a kind of a linear transition over time, right? Like we used to burn wood, then we did coal, then we did petroleum. Now we're going to do, PV solar and things like that. And Tom and I are certainly not the only historians, but part of a small group of historians who really, I think, are constantly emphasizing to say, wait, it's much more complicated than that. Ethanol is an old fuel that's been tried many times. It's not a clear-cut case that this is, going to be the bridge to the next logical thing. Coal has been an obsolete fuel for 70 years, and yet coal use last year was the highest it's ever been in human history. So those two things are true at the same time. And I think it's an important rejoinder to a lot of the debate that happens in those circles about how we think about energy and energy sources over time.
Yeah, it's such a and also such an important, in addition to complicating things, I think it's such an important way of seeing that there's lots of possibilities,
Yeah.
right? That's one big message of this book.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in and just echo what Tracy has been saying about how much I learned from this really excellent book. I really thank the two of you for writing it and bringing it to our attention. And precisely, as historians, we're always saying, well, it's more complicated than that, and that's certainly what you're showing. And then, just as a someone who also studies Latin America, it was really interesting for me to see. It is very much a transnational flow, but it's not always the expected flow of, oh,
Right.
Brazil, the less developed country, is going to import this technology from the United States, but often it's going the other way, that the expertise is really developed down there, and people from the United States go down to visit to see, oh, maybe we can learn something from the Brazilians. So I found that, of course, refreshing as well. So I will invite anyone to put your questions in the chat. And John Anfinson, if you want to elaborate more on your question, but he's already put in, and I know that you do address this in the book, that he's interested in sustainable aviation fuel, and alternative crops to soy and corn for that fuel.
Yeah.
So if you can write that more, John, or I can try to unmute you, but
No, and I'm happy to try to address that. And John, if you're able to unmute, feel free to jump in. We do talk about it at the end of the book. It certainly is seen as, maybe the next front. If you talk to ethanol people in the US and Brazil, they often see sustainable aviation fuel as like the next frontier for the fuel, because of course, electrification has now put into question, do cars and trucks need any liquid fuel whatsoever? But at least as we stand so far, there's no real good options for electrifying aviation or switching it to hydrogen or things like that. So the only kind of maybe near term, like to say 20-year way of driving down emissions from aviation is seen as switching over to fuels that are less carbon intensive. And that's kicked off a whole debate about this. And in terms of alternative crops, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the really interesting things. There's often a sort of a vision that ethanol would be a way to diversify these giant monocrop agricultural systems that developed in the United States. They play around with all kinds of stuff. You might remember President George W. Bush talking about switchgrass and things like that. Or in Brazil, they have plans for using manioc and things like that. But again, none of those have quite worked out, I think, largely due to agribusiness's influence and some other factors.
So Jeff and Tom, I think I'm off I'm muted. So I got my PhD in history at the U a while before you guys. But I'm a founding board member of Friends of the Mississippi River, one of the leading environmental organizations on the river. It's now a $4.5 million organization with 27 staff. But I'm an environmental historian. That's what I've become. And so we are actually the first jet took off from St. Paul, Minneapolis International Airport last September on fuel, partially with camelina. And so we're working on that hard with Delta Airlines, Cargill, other industries to ship because by 2015, the airline industries agreed to go net zero carbon emissions. If they go to corn and soybeans, and I don't know about sugar, if this fits in the same way, it's going to be worse for the Mississippi River and nitrogen and sediment pollution of the Mississippi River. If we can get to do these crops that you can rotate in with corn and soybeans, then we could reduce the amount of pollutants into rivers. And so you made me think about this internationally. We might do the right thing in America, but if the world market's not doing the same thing, does it just undermine it all? I was hoping our lead water person was going to be on tonight, but he's not. So I'll ask for him. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Do you have any more to say to that question, or Jeff or Tom, or?
One note, I mean, just the where you ended, John, about like, that we're in a huge broad, I mean, aviation is an international business, obviously, and these airliners are flying all over the world and need to fuel up all over the world, and so we need fuel sources and all of that. And Brazil has really, really invested in at least policy structures that are supposed to accelerate the move towards alternative fuels just recently. So probably most of you are aware that the Conference of the Parties for the Kyoto Protocol, the last phase iteration of that was in Belém in the mouth of the Amazon River last November. And Lula, the president of Brazil, took that opportunity to announce the Belém 4X pledge on sustainable fuels, where he said we're going to put 4 times the amount of resources so that we can make 4 times the amount of sustainable fuels. And what he was building on was a series of legislative accomplishments that were stretched out over the previous year, starting with October of the previous year, October of 24, with the Fuel of the Future law, which was producing more ethanol, yes, but also other renewable and sustainable fuels. And then in December of 2024, they created a carbon market that is supposed to facilitate the decarbonization of fuel industries. And then in January, they signed the Energy Transition Acceleration Program that goes by the acronym PATEN. And that sequence is showing the Brazilian priority of trying to build towards sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, among other things. But SAF is one of the big priorities. So that's not quite answering like what they want to do is mainly use sugarcane as the feedstock. And then as Jeff has noted, he's also been looking at this. And Jeff, you might have, I mean, we did talk to a lot of people about other feedstocks. I don't know how much we want to get into that.
Yeah, no, in the interest of time, I don't want to clog it up because it gets deep in the weeds really quickly, for better or for worse. We tried to clear that out. But John, happy to talk more about it with you. And I'm about midway down the Mississippi, so appreciate the work you guys are doing, and awesome to see environmental historians out there doing that work. And I'd love to chat if you ever want to reach out.
Great. So we have a couple questions actually from Barbara. So I'll read a couple and you can choose which you want to start with. So the first, she was asking about sources and methodology, which you did talk about, and you did talk about interviewing quite a few of people who work in the agribusiness and so forth. But she's wondering if you also had access to corporate sources and how that worked out. And then coming out of this other discussion, she's also interested in what makes someone a farmer. Food, fibers, fuel. Does this make farmers think about themselves differently depending on what they're growing? So a couple of very different questions. You can go in the direction that you would like to with those.
Yeah, great question, Barbara. It's awesome to see you. Um, and Tom can jump in here too. We did not have any access to corporate archives. Some bits of corporate archives end up in policy archives. In the case of the United States, we used a little bit, like I said, the Carter Library. I did some archival research there, the Reagan Library. And then a lot of congressional papers. Most of the actual action around ethanol policy in the U.S. comes from Midwestern members of Congress, particularly senators. So like people like Bob Dole, Birch Bayh, and so it kind of ends up there. Agribusiness corporations are just notoriously hard to access their archives. Cargill does have a big archive, and they just don't let anybody see it, as far as I can tell. And I've asked around about that. So if anybody knows somebody, let me know. I'd love to get in there and see it. Same thing with ADM here. And then to your question about what makes someone a farmer, that's a great question. One of the very basic things you find early on in this is like the people who are doing this work at global scale oftentimes don't even call themselves farmers, right? They'll say they're growers or they're producers. They've adopted a kind of a really, industrial sort of language, except when it comes time to lobby, for their needs in Congress. Then they're just an old-fashioned family farmer, who happens to grow on two continents and, be a complex LLC that hedges its bets in financial markets by the hour. But they're just Farmer Joe when it comes time to walk the halls of Congress. So this is one of the interesting dichotomies we found.
Yeah, I want to take this opportunity since Tracy had gestured earlier towards the kind of the difference between like corn farmers in the Corn Belt in the United States and sugarcane farmers in Brazil. And while I think corporations like Cargill and ADM are notoriously closed books, that the same is true in Brazil, but in this like long, deep historical way, because the people that we were writing about were known in Brazil as barões de açúcar, or the sugar barons, because it harkens back to a long colonial history of sugar being the first, marketable commodity after dyewood for Brazil, dating back to the 1530s and 40s. And this kind of heritable aristocracy growing up around it. I mean, there's a long history that I'm just kind of flying over, but that was concretized in the 19th century under the Brazilian Empire. A lot of these people acquiring actual noble titles when it went through this period of 70 plus years as an empire. And so these people have long been seen as part of the kind of Brazilian oligarchy, with these gigantic latifundias, these huge tracts of land. And so the agribusiness companies that have been formed by these same families are absolutely impenetrable. I had this incredible good luck writing my first book, again, about mostly really looking at the 50s through the 70s, where one of these big old sugar factories went so far into debt that the workers were able to take it over because the bank had to give to the largest debtors the ownership of the property, and the largest debtors collectively were workers. And it was this fascinating experiment in the late 90s and early 2000s when I was there doing dissertation research. They brought in a field manager from Cuba. It was this wonderful experiment of autogestão, or self-governance. And so I could look at the family's records stretching back. But that's like a bizarre piece of luck. So anyway, it's just a lesson about the impenetrability of corporate archives across borders in this case.
We still have time for a couple more questions if people want to raise those. And in the meantime, I don't know, we sort of get a long view of who is a producer or a farmer in Brazil. And Jeff, certainly today that there's a lot of consolidation, but do you see this thread looking different in the sort of historical look at who's growing these crops that can be used either as food or a sugar sweetener or an alcohol fuel, or how did that work out in that kind of longer historical framework?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one way that I think about answering that is, we found just some interesting stories about at least on the U.S. side, the long efforts to find non-food outlets for American crops. I mean, go back to, the early 1920s, 1930s, there was just a widespread sense that, U.S. farmers faced a problem of overproduction. They just were growing far more than people could consume. So you get, this whole chemergy movement of the 1930s, people imagining, basically replacing all the petrochemical feedstocks of modern chemistry with biological feedstocks. So this is, making cellulose out of corn and things like this. Basically, like half of Iowa State University was doing this in the 1930s, basically finding ways to turn corn into ever more, I don't know, more and more things spinning out of the corn kernel, basically. Which, as we said, I think there's an interesting analogy to what happens with oil, right? There are those classic examples of, from a single barrel of oil, we can produce rayon and, gasoline and asphalt and things like that. And there's an analogous move with corn as well. I think of that factory in Decatur, right? The corn kernels come in one end and the high fructose corn syrup and ethanol and cornstarch and Doritos and all kinds of stuff. So it has a long history, I think, of not just food, but, really thinking of these farmers who are thinking of themselves as kind of industrial producers of an industrial raw product more than, food to go to a farmer's market or something.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know if we can try to quickly answer the last two questions that have come in. Oh, one of them is being answered online in the chat. So I'll pose Eunice Kim's question and asking rather selfishly, thinking about using this in the classroom with undergraduates. Is there a particular chapter, if you can't have the undergraduates read the whole book, is there a chapter you would say, or maybe depending on the class, one or more chapters depending on the topic of the class that you think would work really well for students?
Tom, what do you think? I'll put you on the spot first.
I mean, I think we tried to write the chapters to stand alone. It should hang together as a book, obviously, but we teach ourselves, and we know how much we teach individual chapters, and know that that's a useful thing to do, and that we hope people will dip into it and just read a chapter here and there. I don't think I have a favorite chapter, honestly, but do think that depending on the period of history, any of them can absolutely stand alone for reading.
Yeah, we did try hard to make them stand alone. I will say, if it was I think it depends a little on what you're looking for. I love the 70s energy crisis stories. I think are always, students I always find are always sort of surprised by that anew all the time. Yeah. I think particularly the Brazilian story, just the sense that, here was one of the largest nations on earth that made a concerted effort to move its entire auto fleet away from oil in response to the energy crisis. And few people know about it. It blows people away every time. So that's chapter 3 in the book, or chapter 7, I think, which gets at the kind of more modern. I think if someone wants more modern, climate policy stuff, we start to get into that. How do you measure the life cycle carbon emissions of a fuel? And we went and talked to people at Argonne National Labs about that. It ends up in a place of, almost kind of ontological debates of like, well, how, if a farmer in North Dakota changes their crop one way, what happens down in, deforestation with the Amazon? Can we measure all of that? To my mind, this raises sort of just really fascinating questions about how we think about our ability to understand this stuff and make policy based on it.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I really highly recommend, whether you're going to read a couple chapters or read the whole book or assign it in a class, it's well worth it. As I said, I learned so much. And each chapter, getting back to the transnational, will have Brazil in the US. So it isn't like by choosing one chapter, you're going to lose part of that story. It's completely intertwined. So I think Amanda will be putting a couple links in the yes, our next month on March 18th, we're going to be joined by alumnus Kevin Weddle talking about his prize-winning book, The Complete Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution, which is a timely topic as we approach And I've been practicing saying this, the semi-quincentennial of the Declaration of Independence this summer. And if you're moved to support our current graduate students who are going to go on and write the books that we will feature in future book talks, we have a link that you can contribute to our graduate fellowship fund. So that's another time. So with that, I will wrap up the formal event for today, thanking Tom and thanking Jeff, our alum, for coming and sharing this book, thanking Tracy for posing such interesting questions, thanking all of you for coming, listening, and also posing really great questions.